Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at Eduard's latest release, and that is their bloody 100th 1/40th scale B-17F. It is absolutely huge, and it has been highly anticipated ever since it was released off of the back of Masters of the Air, so let's crack it open and take a look. So before we begin, this does say Eduard on the box, however the tooling and the kit itself is on the whole made by HK or Hong Kong models. So with that in mind, let's get cracking on. On screen now you can see me putting together the braces, which is going to hold the co-pilot and the pilot's chair. These are made up of 3 pieces and they are relatively sturdy. 2 control columns can be cemented onto either side of the cockpit floor, and then I can use the first bit of photo etch, which is to enhance the throttle quadrant itself. After this, the rest of the parts can just be snipped off of the sprue, as there isn't a huge amount of actual sub-assembly, and they can all be primed in Mr. Finishing Surfacer of 1500 black. Once that is dried, I can get the first bit of colour onto this build, and that is going to be using Mr. Colour's C351 Zinc Chromate Interior Green. I'm going to be black basing this colour onto the model. So black basing is where you pretty much do highly concentrated areas in the middle of panels or areas of interest, and leaving the bracing and other aspects a bit darker. So what this then naturally does when you start to blend everything back in is it gives different tones on the areas like the bracing, so they are naturally more pronounced. It is just a way to create some visual interest in the paint rather than having one bold colour. This process is repeated on the entirety of the interior where zinc chromate is required. Once I had left that to dry, I could then mask off certain areas of the interior which needs to be sprayed in a bare metal colour. And the colour which I'm going to be opting for here is Super Metallic 203, also known as Super Iron 2, and the reason that I've opted to use this colour is I really like the tone of it, and I also have quite a lot of it, so this was a great excuse to try and use some of that paint up. I'm approaching it in the exact same way that I did for the zinc chromate, black basing, initially going in the interiors of all of the panels and then starting to blend across. I wasn't too sure how this effect was going to work using a metallic paint, but it actually seemingly worked very well indeed. I think it really worked on the interior of the fuselage, as you can see here, really started to pronounce all of that ribbing. With the base and main colours all sprayed down, I could then come back in and start to block in a couple more of the fine details. To do this, I'm going to be using Amomig's acrylic paints, as I find them the most enjoyable to brush paint with. With the majority of the details all picked out throughout the fuselage, I can now start to bring some of the assemblies together. Initially, here is the bracing, or the cradle I guess, for the co-pilot and the pilot's seats. The seats themselves can be given some photo etched seat belts before being cemented onto the cradle itself. Do keep in mind here that it is not the most positive fitment. What I mean by that is it is pretty much just a butt joint onto the cradle or the brace themselves. So do keep that in mind, take your time, maybe use some super glue just to be super careful. The sub-assemblies and the interior of the fuselage are then all given a dusting of VMS's satin varnish, and after that has dried, it gave me a great base to do some dry brushing with an oil brusher. The purpose of this was just to enhance and bring out some of those details which might have been hidden before. Then continuing to build up the cockpit, both of the sidewalls can be cemented into position. You should be able to see the lovely 2 big locating tabs or slots into either side of the walls. This makes fitting them and getting them into the right angle very easy. There was one thing in this build which I was a little bit concerned about going into, and that was doing a realistic looking wood grain texture for the doors in the B-17. So what I did with any of my modelling problems was approach my local model shop, Hundredth London. Hundredth London is a model shop located just next to the RAF Hendon Museum. It is stacked with all the kits, paints, tools and built models you could ever ask for. A benefit to it being a physical model shop is that there are real live people in there. So I went and scratched the local World War I biplane modeller's brain, who has lots of experience making wood grain textures, and he pointed me in the direction of a mahogany oil brusher and just streaking it on. It worked an absolute treat. So if you're in the area and looking for some kits, tips and anything model related, Hundredth is your place. Their details are on screen now, and I hope to see you down there soon. Whilst I was talking about the brilliant Hundredths, you might have seen me continue on with the cockpit. I put together the instrument panel, which was made out of photo etch and looked very crisp indeed, and then I slapped that onto the front. On screen you can see me now putting together the bomb bay. There are 6 bombs of course in the B-17, and you might also see that there is a slight cast texture on them. This does not come out of the box, and instead I used some Mr. Dissolved putty and just started to stipple it onto the bomb. It's quite a quick and easy way to add a bit more interest to your bombs. Then the bare metal top side or top half of the bomb bay can be attached through those 2 locating pins. To then enclose the bomb bay, this rear bulkhead is slapped onto the end, once again having these 2 locating pins dictate its fitment, and it fits very well indeed. I found that on the whole all of the interior sub-assemblies went together very quickly and very easily. The overwhelming theme with this kit was very well engineered in terms of they didn't over-engineer it, they didn't make it too complicated when it didn't need to be. The final part of this front section of the B-17 is the radio operator's station. Once that was secure, I could then raise this front portion of the B-17 up to 1/2 of the fuselage and cement it into position. I found everything to line up into its locating slots with relative ease. There was a couple of areas which needed a bit of pushing and a bit of bending, but nothing too detrimental. Now focusing my attention to the rear half of the Flying Fortress, I'm working on the waist gunner stations. This was a relatively straightforward part of the build, only consisting of 3 parts, an ammunition box, a machine gun, and also a piece of flooring, so very quick and easy. The tail wheel housing is cemented into position at this stage as well, and then I can go back to the waist gunner position and put in the main walkway. This does have a bit of flex, this piece, which you definitely do need to utilise to get it into position. It kind of always wants to push itself back up, so what you need to do is bend one end and push it into position first. Hopefully you can see me do this here. Now one of the final assemblies to go into the B-17 is going to be the tail gunner. This is built up, once again quite simply, 2 ammunition boxes on either side, and then 2 machine guns which lay on a little pole in front. Once this has been assembled, it can very carefully be lowered into that rear part of the fuselage. There's only 1 locating pin here, so make sure that you use super glue or something which cures very quickly. And the finishing touch for this half of the fuselage is going to be cementing on the rear portion of that tail. And once that is all secured, that pretty much finishes up the interior. All that was left now was to take the other side of the fuselage and sandwich everything in between. Luckily fitment here was not an issue at all, as everything fit perfectly. One thing I would say is that there is a lot of plastic here of course, so if you are building this kit yourself, do make sure that as much of it is cemented as possible. You really don't want this thing cracking on you. Before we move on, I thought we might as well take another look at the interior in some slightly more high definition photos, just before we never see it again. So to kind of conclude on the interior, I think it is absolutely great. The additional photo etch that Eduard gives you is also a nice little addition, but this is not where the real kind of value of the kit is. But before we can get onto that, we have to continue to build on the spine for a little bit. All I'm doing here is I'm fitting the radio operator's turret station. This has relatively okay fitment. The only thing is, it did need a little bit of chopping on the gun to get it to fit, as it just wasn't. So I'm not too sure if I did something wrong there or if this just doesn't fit, but there you go, keep that in mind. Now here is, in my opinion, the star of the show for this kit. Wow, just completely molded out of glass, which is, I didn't even know that was possible, to be completely honest with you. And I really don't get how they can do like the completely see-through bits and then the not so see-through bits. So yeah, very, very cool. I'd love to learn all about it. And really, only the outer walls are the part that Eduard have molded here. The other parts are all from the HK main kit, and they just build right onto this without any real issues at all. As in this part here, which you can see me building up, and that is the floor of the nose. That is straight out of the box from the HK kit, but it works seamlessly into the Eduard bit. So very impressive how well they've managed to integrate the 2 kits here. However, continuing on about what's actually happening, there you could see the little workstation for the navigator, and now I'm starting to put in the seat for the bomb aimer. I think that's the technical name for what this guy does. But once that is secure and in position, the entirety of the little floor and also the sidewalls can be given a generous coating of Mr. Finishing Surfaces 1500 Black, just to unify the surface before I can then go on and spray the super iron too. This is sprayed on in the exact same way as on the interior, as it has been black based, so spraying the interior first, or the interior of the panels, and then working my way out. The included masks for this nose section of the B-17 can then be pulled off, and then the machine gun, I guess it's a holder, or the bracing for it, can be slotted into position. Now we can use even more photo etch, once again putting some seat belts onto a couple of the seats. However, only for the bomb aimer. There wasn't any photo etch or seat belts for the navigator, so I guess he's just going with the flow. I don't really know. But anyway, the Norden bomb sight can then be cemented right onto the front, and then finally, to kind of complete the floor, we're going to be putting in some of the ammo crates. Do note that there is no positive locating points for this, so you're more of just like a free-for-all. Put them where you want, I guess. One of the final parts before we can actually bring everything together is putting together some of the machine guns. There is some photo etch gun sights included, which I thought was a very nice addition, as it just makes them look that little bit more in scale. After being painted up, they can be slotted through the nose and straight onto the outside before they are inevitably broken. I wish there was a more secure way of doing this, as I did break off 2 of the machine gun barrels. Then either side of the nose can be slotted together before then feeding the floor section through. I thought it was better to do it this way, as once again there's not a huge amount of positive locating pins for the floor on either side of the fuselage. To then finally enclose that interior, there is the top section which is slotted on. Then there is a nice little bubble canopy or bubble viewing area which slots just on top of that. Moving on to the glass nose section now. Unfortunately there was a small bit of quality control, or as in this interior green part colour, not too sure what it is, once again a bit of bracing. That was unfortunately broken and there was not a replacement. There should have been parts of it which are there, but they're of course missing. So that was a slight shame, but in the end of the day, it's not the end of the world. So here is a final look at that nose section once again before you never see it again. There is some superb details in there, and I think it is great to see the windows integrated into the fuselage. I would love to see more manufacturers doing this in the future, as it definitely reduces any issues of having, you know, at the end of the build some sticky out windows which really ruin the in-scale effect. The nose section is then slotted onto the front of the fuselage, and you'll be pleased to know that on the whole it is a very good fit. The gap is potentially just that little bit too big to be classed as a panel line, however you can make your mind up when you see it in the final photos. So pushing on now with the rest of the build, with the lovely Eduard stuff out of the way. Here is the glass being integrated into the spine. It has a really quite nice fit, however there is a gap on the very back of it, so I had to use some Vallejo putty there just to kind of square everything out. Once all of the glass is into the spine, it can be slotted on top with the rest of the fuselage, and as you can see there is a little bit of play there which needed to be sorted out. What I ended up doing was using some masking tape and kind of pulling and stretching it until it got into position and just leaving it there while the glue cured. So in the end it wasn't that big of a deal. The final parts to now be cemented onto the fuselage assembly is the tail gunner's glass, the 2 access hatches as you saw, and that pretty much sums it up. All of the glasswork could then be masked off using the 3 included masking sets for this kit. So it's pretty good value for money, isn't it, considering this is retailing at about £150. Might vary where you are. However, the kit itself is about £120. The extra sprue would have cost quite a bit to tool itself. So, you know, Eduard are doing you a really good deal here, and it's a special edition. So if you can, I would highly recommend getting one of these. Now moving away from the fuselage, as that is pretty much now complete, I'm building up both of the wheel wells. These have quite good assembly, as they use the rear bulkheads almost as a kind of jig, and everything builds around that in quite a simplistic fashion. There potentially isn't that much detail for a kit of this scale, but then on the other hand, it is absolutely huge, so how much of the time are you going to be picking it up and looking in the wheel well? Probably not that much. Once it is secured in position, the top half of the wing can join the lower half of the wing, sealing and securing it in place. Now turning my attention to have a look at the engines. There is the optional extra of using some of the Eduard photo etch if you feel you need to. I personally would recommend that you do because the engines themselves are rather soft in the detail department. There isn't any nice ridges between the pistons, so if you get on with photo etch, definitely give them a go. After all four had been photo etched up, they could be painted and then they could be secured to the cowling. Initially they are cemented to the gills of the cowling, and then the main cowling itself slips on over the top. There are some nice little locating tabs, which means that if you just spin it, it will slot into position and you know you've got good fitment. Keep in mind, if you are building this kit and you do want to cement them on at this stage, use something like PVA glue, which can be removed, because later on when you have to cement the resin superchargers in place, they need to go behind these cowlings. So if you are going to be making this kit, secure them on initially with PVA glue. That pretty much sums up all of the building for this build, so everything can then receive a generous coating of Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black. And this is what it looked like. It looked very black indeed, but that is exactly what we wanted because it revealed to me all of the imperfections in the paintwork. I could then sort them out before moving on to the main paintwork. So after priming, my compressor was probably the temperature of the sun, so I instead opted to use these little spray cans, which are the exact Mr. Hobby colours. So the underside was sprayed in Mr. Colours C13, and what I'm now going to do is switch back to my airbrush, but instead I'm going to use Mr. Colours C13 with a couple of drops of white to create a lighter tone, and just to start to break up this very big and monotone underside. The first step was going to be to mask off a different panel here and there, and just spray them in this lightened tone. What I wanted this to do was just create a variety of tones throughout the wing. You can see here that I am initially using some masking tape to create a very harsh border between the lighter tones and then the darker tone underneath. You'll see here you go, here's the result here. And then I'm going to move on to create some slightly more natural, soft moving tones throughout some of the raised details across the wing. This ended up giving me a nice variety between very sharp-edged and harsh differences and some slightly more nice gradients between the different tones, and just generally started to break up the wing. Hopefully here you'll be able to see that final result. At this stage I was very happy, but I also thought it needed to be brought down a couple of notches as it was looking very light indeed. So what I did is I used Mr. Colours C137 Tire Black and mixed it into the Mr. Colours C13 Neutral Grey, and then shaded it along all of the panel lines across the underside of the wing. I didn't want this colour to be too opaque and too in your face, so that led me to thin it down about 90%, and I'm only using about 0.8 bar here. After I'd left that to dry, here was the effect, and I was very happy with how it was looking. So happy that I thought I would call it good there. What I then did was spend about an hour or so masking off the fuselage and also the wings, before I could then move on to the Mr. Colour C12 Olive Drab. Once again, using that spray can to give me that base tone to then work off of, I'm going to be following a very similar technique to what I did on the underside. This time, however, I'm going to be using 4 different tones of the olive drab. I use Middlestone, zinc chromate, and also white to create all of these tones. What I then do is load them into the airbrush one at a time, and then randomly pick out panels to be sprayed in the different colours. What this does is give me a huge amount of different tonal variation all across the aircraft, and it works so well on this front section where there are loads of panels stacked on top of each other. That pretty much summed it up for the initial tonal variation, until I then looked onto the paint scheme and noticed this very small detail. On Piccadilly Lily, just where the waist gunners are, you can see just under the insignia that there is actually the old insignia having been masked off and painted out. To replicate this, I got out my disc-based circle cutter, cut out a circle, and then cut out a bit of the bar just to try and replicate this shape. I don't think it is inch perfect, but it's good enough for me. I could then use Mr. Colour C38, which is a darkened olive drab, and sprayed it on. Once it was removed, it gave the idea that there had just been fresh paint laid down. If you look closely in the final photos, I hope you will still see this final detail, as after putting the varnish on, it did drown it out just that little bit, but keep your eyes peeled. I really like the tone of that Mr. Colour C38 when I sprayed it down, so for the post shading I thought I'd reuse it again. Once again, I'm going to be using Tire Black to darken it down, and then it is thin 90% and sprayed on very carefully along all of the panel lines. once again giving this nice battle hardened and shaded effect. It was really fun when doing this because I really did start to see all of those initial tones with the zinc chromate and the middle stone start to pop as they were broken apart from each other. Here you can see just how many different tones of olive drab there actually are on this aircraft. I was suitably happy with how everything was looking now, so I made the bold decision to now remove the masking tape. As you can see, very satisfying. I absolutely love this stage of the build. However, as I am taking masking tape off, more must go on. So I'm going to be masking off all of the de-icing boots on the tail and also on the wings. I didn't show you the wings just because it's masking, it's nothing too interesting. Piccadilly Lily is also quite unique as the bottom half of her de-icing boot had been removed just to reveal the bare metal underneath. The rest of them were sprayed in Mr. Colour's C138 Tyre Black. If you are a regular for the Mac Model channel, firstly thank you, but you might also remember the Liberator video where I made a slight muck up. I started to chip the de-icing boots. Everyone will be happy to know that I'm not doing that this time round, they are staying nice and pristine. So, that pretty much sums up the painting. We can now move on to the decals for this kit. You do not get one, you do not get two, but you get 3 whole sheets of decals for this kit. It's probably the main selling point for lots of people on this kit. You can pretty much replicate any of the B-17s seen in Masters of the Air. I'm opting for Scheme B, or so I thought. I unfortunately found that my decals were damaged. You can see the top one here has no carrier film and the bottom one does have carrier film. So of course the bottom one would have worked fine, but the top one did not. After closer inspection, I did find my carrier film. It was all on the tracing paper, so I'm not too sure what went wrong here. What ended up happening though was I have to mishmash about 3 of the schemes into one, so I do apologise about that. But swiftly moving on before I get too upset that I can't have my Piccadilly Lily, we're going to be looking at the included resin superchargers. They are all absolutely incredibly detailed and just look absolutely superb. So to paint them, I'm initially going to base them in an iron colour, and then I'm going to be getting this whole red colour just to create some slightly more warmer tones around some of the recessed details. I was also thinning this down about 70% with Mr. Rapid Thinner. I like using Mr. Rapid Thinner for purposes like this just because the paint dries so much quicker and you know exactly what it's looking like. Finally, just to highlight some of the nice detailed features, I'm going to be using the brass colour. I can't remember the exact number for this, but any brass colour will do. Finally, I'm going to tone everything back down as it looks a little bit wacky as it is, using that initial iron colour. I thin this paint down a bit more than usual just to give me a little bit more control over how much of the effect is still shining through. And to top it off and give it a bit more grime, I'm going to be using a track wash over all of the details. They can then be slotted onto the aircraft and all of them fit on very nicely indeed. Here you can also see what I was saying about earlier about having to take the engine cowlings off before you can fit them on. So do keep that in mind, otherwise you're not going to be able to use these. Whilst I had the wings in my hand, I thought it was a good opportunity to do the exhaust staining. I'm going to be using a red-brown colour and also a black colour, mixed in a 50-50 ratio being sprayed on. After looking at a lot of reference images, this was the shape that came up the most. It's really interesting. I think it looks a little bit like a cocktail glass with those 4 strands going out the back. Very unique, but I absolutely love it. Now the entire aircraft can receive a generous coating of VMS's satin varnish. After I'd left that to dry, I could do a little bit of weathering. I was really happy with how that paintwork was looking from earlier, so I didn't think it needed any shaders or any oil work. Instead, just some chipping with a watercolour pencil did the trick. I've been using these now for probably about 2 or 3 months, and I'm finally starting to get a good technique with them. The tip to them is really gently and quickly tapping it on the surface. Don't try and draw, just tap. Trust me, give it a go. So now on to the final assembly part of the build. Initially the landing gear legs are being cemented into position. They are really big and sturdy, so I had no worries about them here. The wings can then be slotted into place. Really interesting way of these being secured. You kind of slot them on and then push them back. Really quite satisfying actually as well. Try not to hold on to the gear when you're doing this, as I nearly broke one of the landing gear legs, so be careful, but it does work very well indeed. Now having a look at the back of the aircraft, I had to super glue the horizontal stabilizers into position. They have 2 nice big tabs as well, so I wasn't too worried about them ever bending or breaking off or drooping, so all they needed to be doing is push fit into place. Now my personal dreaded part of any build, or any bomber build, is the turrets. So I tried to kind of twist it into position, which is what the instructions tell you to do. But I ended up breaking the bull turret. So on my second attempt, I just kind of push fit it in there and hoped for the best. The machine guns could be slotted into position, and that about sums up the bull turret. The bomb bay doors can now also be cemented into their designated position. I made sure to put most of my cement onto almost the teeth of the bomb bay door, as the actuators themselves aren't the most sturdy and I wouldn't put that much trust in them. So now time to flip over the B-17 for the final time in this build. The mask could be removed, which did unfortunately reveal that some varnish had got onto the inside of the front portion of it. Have no idea how, because that is completely enclosed, so I apologise about that. Maybe Crosby was in there throwing up or something. I guess we'll never know. The turret can be secured, the propellers and the rigging, and that about finishes this build up. So thank you very, very much for watching this video. I really do hope that you've enjoyed it, even with its little kinks here and there. But anyway, enjoy the final photos and videos, and I'll see you next time, guys. Bye bye.